Welcome all to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. We're back with another episode up to Alaska this time. For the first time since Soapy Smith, I believe, which has been a while. It's so great to have James T. Bartlett with me. Originally from London, he is a journalist, historian, and author who has been living in Los Angeles since 2005. Among the publications he's written for, the Los Angeles Times, BBC, Atlas Obscura, Los Angeles Magazine, Variety, and The Guardian. And he is here to share details from his book, The Alaskan Blonde, Sex, Secrets, and the Hollywood Story That Shocked America. Thank you for chatting with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. You're welcome, and thanks for asking me, and hello to everybody out there.
Hello back on behalf of everyone listening. So your area of expertise is Los Angeles history, right? What got you interested in that, and how did you veer course to Alaska?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess it mainly comes from, as you'll be able to tell from my accent and from your intro, I'm not from America originally. I'm from England originally, and I moved over here in 2004, 2005. And Los Angeles being an enormously big city, I tried to get to know the city a little bit of its history, get to know my way around somewhat. And it took some time, but, I got to know the libraries, and I started doing some walking tours and so forth, and got to know a little bit about the history. And then about sort of a number of years after I'd been here, I started to look for some guidebooks. Maybe some guidebooks to sort of show me around a little bit, some of the undiscovered history or some of maybe the much older history of the city. And I couldn't really find one that really sort of talked about the things I wanted to know, which was a lot more of the older history. And I don't mean, the struggle to bring water to LA, which is interesting and I have written about, but I sort of was more interested in maybe the darker side, maybe some of the crime elements, maybe some of the things that we don't necessarily hear about. But again, while there were many books on, Manson and Ramirez and various other serial killers and famous things, there wasn't a lot from a long time ago. So what happened, long story short, is that as a journalist, I was in a bar one day, as journalists often are, and someone told me a story about the bar. It was actually a ghost story about the bar. And I thought it might make an interesting story, but I tried to look it up to see if there was any history within the building, other than, just someone saying, there's a ghost here. And that just led me down a rabbit hole to a lot of bars and restaurants and hotels across Los Angeles and further afield, where they had these stories. They had stories of celebrities who stayed there. Some of them had ghost stories, but a lot of them had criminal-related stories about murders that had happened there, or robberies or arsons, that kind of thing. And especially the hotels had many stories like that. And so I started ending up collecting these stories together and put together a guide called Gourmet Ghosts, because it was all bars, restaurants, and hotels, places you could go, places I could go as a newcomer into town, places locals could go, places tourists could go. And you would pick a location and you would read about the history and the architecture, but then also some of the darker side, some of the celebrity stories, and then maybe some of the stuff that I found in the archives. And that was really when I just began to live in the LA Times archives, going back 100 years, as I would always say, when poison was available everywhere and people used it, and crime wasn't often solved. And it turned out there were a lot more criminal acts and murders and suicides than we ever could have imagined, especially at some places. And they often weren't solved, and they often were forgotten. And so they sort of formed this guide that I put out, and it was really quite popular, which surprised me. So I did a second guide, which was more focused on true crime, because that was the side that I found people were really the most interested in. There's been a huge renaissance in the interest in true crime in the last decade or so, especially, but I found that people were really, really interested in true crime, and especially the historical true crime, stories that they'd never heard of, but that were just as dramatic or exciting or as tragic than maybe the more modern stories. So I did the second book, and in the second book, one of the stories I came across was the story that became The Alaskan Blonde. And briefly, it was it was the end of the story, really, for the Alaskan Blonde. But the story ended at a hotel in Hollywood, two hotels, in fact. Diane Wells, who is the titular Alaskan Blonde, who was charged with the murder of her husband Cecil Wells in Fairbanks in Alaska. When she got bail, she came down to Los Angeles with their son, and she stayed with friends, but she also ended up staying in a hotel in Hollywood. And she actually left that hotel and went to another hotel in early 1954, just before her trial. And that was how it got on my radar for the guidebook, because both of these hotels still exist. The buildings are still there. They're not hotels anymore, but they're still famous, and they were very famous back in the day and very famous in the 50s and before that, when Diane Wells stayed there. And I read the story and I put it in the book, and I just thought, well, that's a great story. I wonder what happened. Which is kind of the simplest thing that so many of us who are interested in true crime often find ourselves asking, what happened? What happened there? What happened before that? What happened to the child that they had? What happened? Did it go to trial? What happened to him? What happened to her? What happened to the family? And I thought to myself, to me, it was very clear. My knee-jerk reaction was, oh, well, I'm sure she went to prison, and I'm sure, the man who was her alleged lover, Johnny Warren, who was charged with murder alongside her, I'm sure he went to prison as well. I'm sure that's probably what happened. It seemed a very contemporary story to me. I thought it was something that if it happened today, even in exactly the same circumstances, it would play out in the same way. So I looked it up to find out what happened, and I didn't really find anything. And so because I was curious, I just did what we all do now. I did a bit of Googling, tried to find a few family names to see if they popped up. And they did pop up. And as I found out during my research, which happened over the next 2 or 3 years, most of the family members didn't know what happened either. And I mean in relation to not only just the murder, but after that. What happened to all the money in the will? What happened to the child that they had? And I ended up speaking to, children and grandchildren of the people involved at the time, because this was the 1950s. So, of course, most of the people who were children then were elderly people now. And they all said to me, we really don't know what happened. No one ever talked about it. It was never discussed. It was either swept under the carpet, or it never came to trial. And people had various theories about what happened. And the more I talked to some of the family members, the close family members, the more I just thought, I would really like to find out what happened for them, because it really seemed to have affected their lives in a lot of ways, which was the most surprising thing. And that was what really drove me in the end. I was a stranger. I was a stranger to them. I didn't have any skin in the game, which is often the case with true crime books and documentaries. Usually it's a relation or a family member or someone that they knew, that someone investigates the story. I didn't have anything in this at all. I'd never been to Alaska. I'm not even from America. I had nothing in the game to do this. But the more I talked to the family members, I thought I'd really like to find out for them, because they'd only looked in it as much as I had. There's a difference between looking on newspapers.com or ancestry.com than actually going to the Alaskan State Archives and getting the FBI file and making freedom of information requests and finding out what the police knew and what they did and how the investigation progressed and how the story ended up. And so the book is 240 odd pages long. The first draft was, twice that, because I had so much information that I thought, well, this should go in there. But I wanted it to be something that people today could read, like I was, who has nothing to do with it, who sees maybe the picture of Diane Wells on the cover, and it's a very striking cover image, and they see the picture, or they might read the story and go, wow, I wonder what happened.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What an interesting shift to go from sunny Los Angeles to chilly Fairbanks. And it's such a fascinating time in American history. This crime happens in the same period when Alaska is debating statehood.
Yes, that was really interesting to me, because, again, as I said, I'm from England. I'm not American. I didn't know very much about Alaska, as I knew it was just this enormous snowy land, very, very far north of America. When I started the research, I didn't even know that in 1953, Alaska wasn't a state, it was a territory. And that actually came into the story because Alaska, like Hawaii, they're very close, Alaska and Hawaii, in many ways. They consider themselves kind of sister states because they were both applying for state status for many years, and they couldn't really get it for various reasons, which were fascinating. But it came into play in relation to this particular murder because in 1953, Cecil Wells, his murder, he was a very influential and important person within not just Fairbanks, but also Anchorage and Alaska as a whole. He was very well known. And him being shot in his bed and the police not immediately finding a suspect or finding the killer was problematic. There had been a series of robberies in Fairbanks where other rich, influential people had been robbed and in other cases injured or even killed by men who'd broken into the building and shot them and stolen. And of course, law and order was one of the big issues in relation to applying to be a state. And, Alaska being so enormously vast and really only having one big center of population, which is Anchorage. Today Anchorage has 250,000 people. The next biggest city is Fairbanks with about 30. So it's a very small population and it's very sparse. And, they had US Marshals, they had state troopers, they had local police. There would be the FBI for federal cases because it was a territory, not a state. So there's a very limited police service generally. And someone rich and quote unquote famous and important getting murdered, that was a big deal. And several of the family members said to me that they really thought it really never came to pass and never came to trial because of the desire to be a state, because that happened in 1959 and really a line was drawn under everything that had happened before. And I found that in my research. If you were looking for something when Alaska was a territory, it could be anywhere and you might be lucky to get it. As soon as it was a state, there was absolutely a place where every record was and they could locate it and they could send it to you. It was like night and day. And several people, and I think it's a good argument, basically it was a murder that was hanging over the state. It was a famous murder. It was infamous, as they say, and it was hanging over it, so they just let it disappear, and they let it sort of disappear when Alaska became a state. And it didn't do Johnny Warren much good because he'd been indicted for murder alongside Diane Wells, and he was on the hook right up until 1960 before they exonerated him. They did keep saying, the newspapers periodically would say it was going to come to trial, it was going to come to trial, it was going to come to trial. And he was on the hook for that all the way up until 1960. But then once Alaska became a state, that was kind of the end of it. And certainly for Cecil Wells's family, they always thought he got a very rough deal. His murder had not been solved. At the time they hired private detectives. They paid detectives from Seattle to give lie detector tests. They contacted Earl Stanley Gardner, who was the creator of Perry Mason. He had a TV series at the time that dealt with miscarriages of justice. And they contacted Earl Stanley Gardner about the Cecil Wells murder, the family, because they thought it was an injustice. And he suggested a private detective for them who they hired expensively. And that private detective didn't find anything. They made some inquiries with the Pinkerton Agency, were engaged at one time briefly to try and solve this murder because the police and the legal law enforcement weren't necessarily doing a good job and they couldn't really bring it to trial.
Right. So let's talk a bit about Diane. She had had some drama in her past before coming to Alaska. And how did she and her eventual husband, Cecil Wells, meet?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, I'll summarize it because I go into a bit more detail in the book. But I guess what you need to know from the start-off point is that Cecil Wells was 50 when he met Diane and she was 30. So there was a 20-year age gap. Cecil had been married 4 times before, so he had five or six children, I think, already. Diane had been married before. She'd actually been married twice before. She had two children, two daughters with her first husband, and her second husband was a very, very brief marriage, less than a year, who she had no children with. But she was estranged from her two daughters. And that was a lifelong estrangement. As I found out, I spoke to her eldest daughter, who I visited in Texas, actually. And she told me that, her mother took her to school one day and never picked her up, and she never saw her again. And obviously that had affected her life. And what had happened, of course, was that her parents had broken up, and her father had thrown Diane out of the house. They broke up, and they were separated. And I think as I looked, as I did my research, I think possibly the in-laws kept Diane away from contacting her children. I'm pretty confident that happened, because Diane always kept a photo of her children with her, and her children never said that she was a bad mother. And I think that she may well have tried to contact them for years. But, you have to remember, this is the 50s. Not even everybody had a telephone. If a letter arrived and you didn't want someone to read that letter, you just took the letter away. So when they met in Seattle, which, as many of your listeners might know, is the sort of the hub point for traveling into Alaska. Everything goes through Seattle, pretty much. So people who live in Alaska even now would come down to Seattle, or even LA, or even San Francisco, for a trip. That was a regular thing, and it all came through Seattle. They met in Seattle, and they quickly married. It wasn't a shotgun marriage or anything like that. I did look into that, but their son, who was called Mark, was born about 18 months later. And then they went up to Fairbanks, because Cecil had enormous business interests initially in Anchorage. He was a car dealer, which sort of sounds kind of we always think of someone a little more sleazy now, but this is the back in the day where everyone wore a suit, and it was a far much more of a hugely respected business. And he had some enormous contracts all across Alaska, so that would have been commercial cars and vehicles and construction vehicles, that kind of thing, and the garage contracts and the supply contracts. So he'd done very well there, and had a bus concerns and taxi concerns. He was involved with the early stages of the Chena Hot Springs, which is very famous in Fairbanks. He was also involved in some property deals in Hawaii, just when they were starting to build rental properties in Hawaii for people to travel to. That building still exists, that he was involved in. So they moved up to Fairbanks, and I believe it was quite the culture shock for Diane, I think. It was a very small town. There's a few thousand people living there. It was a very, very male-dominated town. And it also had, as was the time, we have to remember it's the 50s. Things were very different then, but it was very much that women were often the homemakers and men were the breadwinners, and they came home, and they expected to find a cocktail and dinner on the table. That was the period that we were living in. And Diane had a very nice house in the Northwood building, which still exists. It's 8 stories high. It was called a skyscraper then, but the Northwood building still exists. That was in the center of downtown. It was a very new building, all very fancy, and they moved there after living at another lovely house just across the river. So she lived there, and he bought her a lot of jewels and fur coats, and they had fine china, and they traveled a lot, and they had by all accounts, by many accounts, judging by the photographs, because I've got a lot of family photographs that family members have sent me, they seem to have quite a happy marriage. They traveled a lot. They seem to be happy a lot. The pictures show that they're laughing a lot. Now, of course, there's a difference between what we see in pictures and what goes on behind the scenes, which is something that I talk about in the book. But they were married. They were quite the couple. As I sort of say in the book, they were kind of like a power couple, even though I guess the term didn't really exist in those days. But they were quite the power couple of Fairbanks and within Alaska. She was exceptionally attractive, which is what all the men and the women, in fact, as well, all told me, that she was, by far the most beautiful woman in Fairbanks. The newspapers called her that, the most beautiful woman in Alaska. And that was really the definition of her. If you don't see a picture, she is the archetypal 50s sort of a femme fatale, unfortunately. Blonde hair, beautiful face, with the fur coat on. She looked like a movie star, like all women could when they were photographed in black and white in the 50s. But she really did look like a movie star. There was a touch of Monroe about her, maybe. But anyway, she was a bit of the trophy wife. She was very different from Cecil's previous wives. And they were married for a couple of years, and everything seemed to be going well until October the 17th, 1953, which was the night or the early hours of that morning was when the murder happened.
Yeah. To me, she looks a little like Marilyn Monroe, and also a little like Mae West. She definitely has that classic golden age movie star look about her. So, yeah, how did police become aware that something terrible had happened at the top floor apartment
Yeah,
of the Northward building?
that's right. So they lived on the top floor apartment or penthouse, as they called it, which was actually 2 rooms. They bought 2 rooms, and there was a couple of interconnecting doors. But like I say, it was very fancy for the time. Um, and what happened was at about 7:15, Diane banged on the door of her neighbor opposite. It was just a corridor, just a hallway, so it's very close. And she was bloodied and bruised and crying. And she said, "Call the police. Cecil's dead. 2 men broke in and shot him and beat me up." And the police arrived very quickly, and it was pretty much immediately ascertained that Cecil was dead. He'd been shot while he slept. I mean, it still looked like he was asleep. He'd been shot right close up at sort of in the back of the head, and he looked like he was asleep in bed, but he was dead, clearly dead. And Diane's story that she told the police, she went to hospital and she gave several interviews, and she never veered from the story. She said that in the early hours of the morning, there had been a noise, there'd been some sort of noise, some sort of break-in. 2 men had broken in. She just about woke up in time to see them. She ran out. One of them grabbed her, hit her. There was a gunshot, which was Cecil being shot. She was bashed on the head. She was knocked unconscious. She woke up to find Cecil dead, and that was when she went to go and get help. The idea of there being a robbery did have some collaboration. There was money missing and jewelry missing. There had also been, as I mentioned a little bit before, some previous break-ins locally. There'd been several, not every single week, but there had been several notable ones of local prominent people, including one of which a person had been shot as well. And that was still an unsolved crime. So police were thinking this is another, murder break-in that's again turned violent. Diane was sent to hospital. There's pictures of her in some of the newspapers. She looks like a, for want of a better word, like a panda. She has two black eyes, and like a cut lip and a cut cheek, and swollen face. She's been beaten up, as she said she was. But the police were a little unsure about what she said in her story. The money and the jewelry seemed to turn up, or seemed to have not been where they were and weren't actually stolen after all. But the big thing that changed things was that police got a tip a couple of days later that Diane had been having an affair, or allegedly having an affair. And the affair that she was having was with a guy called Johnny Warren, who was a black musician. He was a touring musician. He'd been in music all his life, and he lived in Fairbanks. He's very well known locally. There's a million ads in the local paper for him and his band, and it was alleged that she'd been having an affair with him. Now, that became the thing that really scandalized America more so almost than the murder, because at the time, news from Alaska, which, as I mentioned, was a territory. It was a territory. It was not a state. News from Alaska didn't really make the newspapers in America, let alone the rest of the world. Because it was a territory. It was a far, far off territory where very few people lived. This story made the newspapers all across America. Now, of course, it was syndicated, but it was covered in all the newspapers, and in the UK and in Australia as well. It was a big deal because she was a beautiful blonde, he was a rich husband, and she'd been having an affair with a black guy, or allegedly. And that was almost as negative in people's eyes as the murder. And so within 2 weeks, again, there was a lot of A lot of pissing contests between the various law enforcement agencies involved. There was a new DA, Ted Stevens, who became the senator to Alaska for like 60 years. Very, very famous and influential in the history of Alaska. But this was pretty much one of his first cases. So he was new in Fairbanks. There was a new chief of police who was fairly new in the job and had been heavily criticized. And so you had all these agencies working together, and the FBI were called in pretty much immediately because it was a murder. And capital crimes like that were dealt with by the FBI, not locally. So within a couple of weeks, the arrest warrants went out. There was a grand jury, the arrest warrants went out. Johnny had left town the night of the murder, which didn't look good. That turned out to be, it was a lot worse than it seemed, but he did leave town the night of the murder, which meant he had been seen a lot, which was, I guess, was a good thing, but it also looked like he was running. Now, and he'd driven. So he drove all the way down to Oakland in California to see his sister. And that turned out to be an innocent trip because he actually went with 2 other people. But he was arrested there. He voluntarily went to the police first. Doubtless he had received a phone call that this was going to happen, probably. He went voluntarily to the police first and spoke to them over a long period of time with a long statement and basically confirmed, yes, they had been having what was called intimate relations in those days. He also, I couldn't prove it, but I don't know any other way it's possible. He also gave the police several letters that Diane had written to him. Love letters. They're not pornographic or anything like that. They're kind of like teenagery type. But he gave the police these letters because they really wanted to prove that there was a connection because, of course, they were both charged with the murder. And then it looks like a conspiracy between lovers. As for Diane, she had left Fairbanks actually for Los Angeles, which again was not an unusual occurrence in those days. They had friends there. They did go down there quite regularly. She was arrested at Seattle. Seattle, again, comes into it at Seattle Airport because you always have to change at Seattle. And she was arrested there. And that was where pretty much all the photographs that we have of her at the time were taken. The ones of her in the big fur coat looking terrified. The paparazzi photo, which is on the cover of the book. She's in a corridor and she looks like she's being hounded by these paparazzi. And she was arrested at Seattle, taken to court, given all the charges, and put straight back on the plane that night, back to Fairbanks, where again we get into the legal element. It's questioned how could both Diane and Johnny be charged with murder when only one of them could have pulled the trigger. But anyway, Diane got out on bail, which I guess you could do being a territory, and she went straight back down to Los Angeles, and that was where she was for the next few months. She went with the son, Mark, and enrolled him in school and really tried to start a new life there. I kind of speculated it was because it was a very big city and she was completely anonymous. She couldn't be anonymous in Fairbanks. She certainly couldn't be anonymous anywhere in Alaska at all. Everyone knew who she was. Whereas Johnny he was extradited because, again, it was a territory, not a state, so you had to be extradited. He was extradited back to Fairbanks. He paid a smaller amount of bail and he was set free, and the trial was set for 4 or 5 months later. And that sort of gets us to the stage of that's post-murder. But as far as the media were concerned, and again, that was how I thought it was so relevant to today. As far as the media were concerned, she was guilty from the beginning. She was blonde, she was attractive, she was young, she was obviously after the money, she'd been having an affair. And that was how I found it to be so contemporary. Johnny was never really considered as the murderer. Even the U.S. Marshal, whose private documents his daughter sent me, which were quite revealing. But the U.S. Marshal who took Johnny back to Fairbanks from Oakland, in handcuffs, there's pictures of that. Even he said publicly to reporters, I think he's involved, but he's not the killer. I mean, he said that publicly, and he said it in his private notes as well. He said that he didn't think Johnny was involved in that way. But at the time, it was a very scandalous murder, and people had to be charged, and something had to happen. And again, it's like today, something like that happens, we expect an arrest. And so these 2 people were on the hook, and then they were waiting for this trial to start in April of 1954.
So, yeah, I want to ask you a bit about the crime scene.
Yeah.
There are a couple of pieces of evidence that investigators really hone in on.
Yeah.
One, a pair of pajamas And two, the weapon that was used to kill Cecil Wells. Could you address those?
Yeah. The murder weapon is an easy one to address first. They never found it. Is the conclusion of that? They found the cartridges, the slugs. There was one under Cecil's head in bed, and then they found another one in the bedding later. It was not a great investigation. It was a little sloppy, but they did find the cartridges. They were able to identify them, and they sent them to the FBI. And this is all in the FBI file. And the FBI said, right, find us the gun. We can match the cartridge to the gun. And the FBI never gave up doing that right up until Johnny Warren was exonerated in 1960. They sent 4 guns in all over like a 6-year period that they had either found in the basement of a club in Fairbanks or that someone had said he had sold to Johnny Warren. All these guns got all sent to the FBI and they were never the right gun. But there were guns in the house, this being Alaska. You didn't have to have a license for a gun. You didn't have to have any registration for a gun. And it was Alaska. So there were guns in the house, but it was not the murder weapon, which was a 380 Beretta. That's what it was determined to be. So they never found the gun despite looking for it. And they did pretty much tear the apartment and the building apart looking for the guns. They never found the gun, which was always a problem in terms of proving or linking the bullet to the gun. The other piece of evidence was, as you say, the pajamas. And I went quite deep on the pajamas and doing the research. I actually managed to find a picture of the particular design of the pajamas that they mentioned at the time, which was like a cowboy, on the back of a horse with a lasso. But yes, what had happened was, I'll try not to get too much in the weeds, but during the previous night before the murder, Diane had been unwell. She'd woken up in the middle of the night and it looks like she'd thrown up. Either she'd thrown up into the toilet or thrown up on herself or a bit of both. And she had taken these pajamas off, or at least I'm sure the pajama top or whatever it was, whether it was the initial night dress or bed clothes, as they called it in those days. She'd taken that off and presumably, like we all would have done, either thrown it in the laundry basket or thrown it on the floor or put it in a bag or something because, smells of sick. And Cecil had given her a pair of his pajamas, male pajamas, which were these cowboy ones. And those were the ones that she was, that had her blood on it from the beating. So those were the ones that she was wearing when she was not arrested, but went to hospital. The problem with the police investigation was that they never did anything with the pajamas that were in the bathroom or in the laundry basket. And of course, the question arises, well, if they weren't covered in sick, or even if they were, how do we know that there wasn't blood on them as well? Because there could have been blood on them and she could have thrown up or thrown up at another time, or that something else could have happened. Either way, they should have taken those pajamas. And they were mentioned, but they never ended up on an evidence list and they never got tested by the FBI. The only pajamas that were tested were the ones she was wearing, and they did have blood on them. And it was determined to be her blood. Of course, again, this is the 1950s, so there's no DNA. All they could tell was the blood group. So they looked at the pajamas she was wearing and they said, okay, well, it is her blood, and the blood on the pajama is consistent with her being beaten. It was splashes of blood from around the face and the head. But they never managed to get these first set of pajamas together. And I can't even quite remember now whether they did ever find them. I don't think they did. But even if they did, they were useless. By that stage, let's assume that it was completely innocent, because Diane never went back to the apartment. She certainly never lived in the apartment again. If anyone ever came across those pajamas again, if they were covered in sick, let's say, I would imagine I would have thrown them out straight away, or maybe put them in the laundry. You have to figure if somebody found them and there was blood on them and they knew about it, they might have said something. But whatever happens, those pajamas never played a part. There was other blood evidence. There was blood on various other items in the apartment, like a shoe, and on something in the kitchen, and obviously on the mattress and the bed and on the wall and on the carpet. And they did take those samples and look into them. But at the time, you could only prove what blood group it was. So of course, if it had proved that it was Cecil's blood group or Diane's blood group, well, that would follow, because they were both injured that night. They were both bleeding that night, so it would follow that there was blood there. So there wasn't an enormously strong case in terms of blood evidence. There were fingerprints. There were fingerprints mainly on a vodka bottle. Actually, again, I went on a deep dive on the internet to find out what exactly alcohol it was. It was a Johnny Walker Red Label was the bottle. And there were some bloody fingerprints on a Johnny Walker Red Label bottle of whiskey. And again, they're only photocopies that in the FBI files. A couple of them look like fingerprints. The rest of them, as they said at the time, were pretty smudged and you couldn't get anything off them. However, the chief of police, Fairbanks at the time, instead of sending those fingerprint samples straight to the FBI, he had them tested locally at a facility which obviously wasn't as good, and they came back with a negative result. And that kind of tainted them, and they were never really able to get anything off the fingerprints again. They sent the fingerprints off to the FBI and other suspects' fingerprints over the next 6 years as well. There were a couple of local people who were known for burglaries. There was a local couple of kind of mobstery type guys. They sent these fingerprints off. They sent the fingerprints off to try and match them with these fingerprints on this. There was a vodka bottle and a whiskey bottle, and they never got a match. So here you are. You've got no fingerprint. You've got fingerprints but no match. You've got blood but no match, and no gun. So what you're really looking at is you're hoping to get a confession. And as I said, Diane always absolutely stuck to her story that two men broke into the apartment. Now, when you look at that, the first thing I thought was, how many people break into random apartments on the top floor of a building? You know, it usually seems you would do the lower floors because you can get away more quickly. But then alternatively, someone could say, well, yeah, but they might have been let in. They might have been expected. So they didn't break in at all. They were let into the building. But what Diane said was that, you know, there was no broken lock on the door, no broken chain on the door. She said that they came through a connecting door from the two rooms, because they had two rooms that were joined together as like a big overall apartment. She said that they came through one of the adjoining doors, and her evidence of that, or her proof of that, was that this door was usually kept permanently closed, one of these doors, and there was actually a picture hanging from the door, and you see it in the crime scene photos. The picture's actually fallen down and is on a chair underneath the door. So her argument being, yeah, well, they pushed their way through the door, and of course the painting fell down. But you look further at the picture and you're like, okay, well, how come then there's a chair against the door, and how come there's a table in front of that? But then you look at the apartment and it's, you know, it's not a luxury apartment. It's pretty close quarters in there. Maybe stuff got moved around when they were taking her out to hospital. You know, but either way, it seemed questionable about her story that two men had just broken in. But she insisted to that right to the end, in the same way that she insisted she had never had an affair with Johnny Warren.
Right. So according to her, her husband is shot. She runs out of the bedroom, and someone beats her over the head with a flower pot.
Yeah, that was the other side. The thing that she said she'd been hit with was a flower pot, and you know, they have pictures of it, obviously, and they sent pieces of the flower pot to be examined. And when we say flower pot, I'm not thinking about those enormous ones that are outside people's houses. I'm only talking about the little ones that you might put a herb in, or a cactus.
Yeah.
You know, they're only little flower pots, and she said she got bashed on the head with a couple of those, which is quite possible, and I'm sure that would have hurt. I don't know whether it would have given you two black eyes, but she had definitely been hit with something, and she had cuts on her head and she had cuts on her face, and, you know, the examining doctor said so. And she said she'd been hit by a couple of those, which you figured were to hand for these two men who broke into the building. That was something to hand that they hit her with. But then, of course, you could go, well, if these are two practiced burglars, which is what was the suspicion at the time, two practiced thieves who were on a series of these, a spree of robbing, surely they would have come in with something a little more useful than, you know, having to grab a flower pot. You know, they might have had, you know, a kosh or a gun or a knife or something that they could have hit somebody with, rather than hoping to grab something that was nearby. But she was hit by it, and it was a flower pot. But, you know, then people said, well, when she got to hospital, she didn't have any earth in her hair. You know, she didn't have any earth from the flower pot when the flower fell out. You know, it was an orchid. You know, there was no earth from the flower. But we weren't in the room. We weren't there that night. We don't know what happened. And it's not an enormous leap to imagine that she woke up, she regained consciousness. You know, she staggered around a bit. She might well have had a drink. She might well have tried to have a drink, or might well have had a drink after she found Cecil dead, or she might well have had a drink at some other time after, before the police had arrived, and that's why her fingerprints had ended up on a whiskey bottle, for example. We just assume, it all seems to make, there's so many ways it could go. But that was what happened. So that was essentially the night of the murder. And then there was the information about the affair. And Johnny Warren was married as well, and was married to a white woman, which didn't go down well with some. It seemed like his wife also worked for Cecil Wells for one of his companies, which I was never able to confirm that, but it just all seemed like, what the hell? This is all very, very close quarters. But like I say, this is a small town. This is a small town where everybody knows everybody. And I did think to myself, well, how did they ever meet? How did they ever get time to spend together, intimate or not? And then I found out during Johnny talked in his interview, his voluntary interview, he said he had a friend who had an apartment in the tallest building in Fairbanks, the Northwood being the second tallest, called the Polaris building. And they met there several times, he said. But it was, still a small town, plenty of gossip. But once the affair was sort of confirmed, the indictments were put, the arrests were out, I'm sure the police were thinking, well, we haven't got a great deal of evidence, but we've got time.
Yeah. So sorry to bring the crime scene up once more.
No, you're right. I probably missed something.
No, it's okay. Why would they kill him and not her? Unless they knew her.
That was something that came up, was that some of the family members I talked to, Cecil's family members, who would be, grandchildren now, who are the ones who are still alive, would be saying, well, what if this was, one of the theories was that it was organized crime, that it was an organized crime, it was a hit, because of, especially of how Cecil was killed, with a shot to like the side of the head, the back of the head virtually. To which I always thought, well, in that case, why did they leave her alive? Why would they have not, tied her up and put her in a closet, or really, beaten her so that she couldn't have told them anything? Or if it was, one of the other suggestions was that she was behind the murder. She paid somebody to kill Cecil. And then I was like, okay, well, then in that case, why didn't she have them, tie her up and put her in a closet so that she could say, all that happened to me was a man came in, put a gag over my mouth, a blindfold over my eyes, locked me in the closet, tied my hands together. I heard a gunshot, and I had to kick my way out of the closet. Just saying that someone beat me with a flower pot, and just seemed to be, you'd be better planned. You'd better plan than that. If it was something that was planned, if it was a professional hit from organized crime, you'd think they'd plan it better. And again, I never found any evidence in the police files or the FBI files of a mention of organized crime in any way. I don't really think they believed that had anything to do with the case. I mean, organized crime wasn't really prevalent in Alaska at the time. It was further down the coast, certainly in sort of Portland and Seattle, and obviously San Francisco and LA and further. But Alaska wasn't really necessarily a huge market for them. It's not that there weren't lots of bars and lots of legal drinking and gambling and prostitution. Of course there was that. But aside from Anchorage, these places are really too small to really justify a huge sort of outlook operation to make a lot of money. That doesn't mean to say that it isn't possible. And I do talk about that in the book, that it's possible that Cecil was killed because maybe he'd been asked to be involved in something he didn't like the idea of, and they decided to make an example of him, perhaps. But it because it never came up in the FBI file or the police file, I kind of discounted that as a possible theory. Because, two strange men coming into town to carry out a contract hit, they better come at night and leave at night, because this is a small town. Everyone would have noticed them. They would have noticed someone who wasn't local.
And they had difficulty, right, trying to determine the time of the murder.
Yeah. It got a lot into the science and the pathology of it now, which, of course, over the decades now, it's all come into question as to how accurate these things are. But judging by the timelines, as for the time of death that the doctor suggested the time of death that the coroner suggested, the times that Diane was saying that things happened. She said obviously that they went to bed round about midnight, so obviously something happened in the early hours. And it is important to establish a time of death because, again, if nothing else, Johnny Warren was seen at the Northwood building a couple of times in the early hours of the morning. It would help to know when Cecil had been killed if Johnny had been within, radius of the building. And what it sort of seemed to come down to in the end, which got confusing, was Cecil's stomach contents in relation to what he'd eaten and digestion, which was a fascinating area. It was really fascinating to read about how that works, but they can theoretically make a sort of evaluation as to what time someone might have died in relation to what's in their stomach, depending on how long it's been. But then, of course, you've got, in this case, it was, they'd gone out for dinner, but he'd had a late meal as well. So then it was like, well, was it made of chicken? Because chicken is digested in a certain amount of time. And then before the early dinner, it was this particular thing, and that digests in a certain amount of time. So it really came down to about a 3 or 4 hour period, which sounds pretty accurate. But some people vehemently disagreed about it. Some people thought it had happened very much just before Diane called the police. Some people felt it had happened, hours before. And in which case, had she really been unconscious on the living room floor for that many hours? If there'd been that many hours, what had been happening in the meantime?
Right, exactly. Another thing, there was a book taken as evidence at the crime scene, and page 46, you write, the corner was folded.
Yeah.
What do you think the significance of that was, if there was any significance at all?
I'm just looking over at my little pile of Alaska books here, and it's not immediately at the front, so I can't pull it out. But yes, there was a book that they took from the crime scene among the other pieces of evidence. They didn't send it to the FBI for testing per se, but it had obviously been a book that Diane had been reading, because there was a little bookmark or other sort of a mark with like nail polish to show sort of the top of the page that I guess she'd stopped reading at or had read last. But I think it was page 46. So I tried to get an old copy of this book and try and find what it was, page 46. And the book's called The Prophet. And it's a very famous, I'd never heard of it, but it's a very famous, still in print today, sort of a new age type book. I don't know another way to describe it other than that, but it's sort of about a person who goes on a journey, and all the chapters are related to chapters like about marriage and about justice and about the law, and they all have these pronouncements and things that you need to think about in relation to these particular things in life. And of course, the pages that the book was open to related to marriage and the law and crime and murder. And I'm sure if I saw it, I would have picked it up and thought, wow, was she reading this the night before or the day before? And did this affect what she was thinking? Or did she read it afterwards? And it never came up in any of the files or anything, but it was interesting to open the books and read about what it was, because some of the quotes in the book you could take as being something that she might have read and felt related to her situation, or related to what had happened, or maybe even related to what she thought she might want to do. And I did read it, looking for some insight, and I read some of the pages, and they took that book at the time, but it's not like she's encircled anything where it says, a woman must be free or something, that kind of thing. But it was of a philosophical, thoughtful bent. And if she'd been reading it, it might have related to how she felt about her life and her marriage, because as I mentioned, not everything was perfect in their marriage, in their relationship, like it is for everybody. Not everything's perfect, but there had been some trouble in their marriage, and that sort of came out mainly after the murder, when the police did the interviews of all the people in the Northwood building, of the neighbors and various other people, and several of the neighbors said, several of them, that they had heard shouting and screaming and arguing and maybe even fighting coming from the Wellses' apartment. Even the child, Mark, their son, who was only 3 at the time, screaming and crying and various things. And it seemed to be, and of course it could be gossip and interview accounts can be notoriously inaccurate. But it did seem like that there was a little bit of trouble at home. And as I went through my research, of course, trying to always not put ideas in people's minds, I did get several people telling me that they thought he was probably abusive, physically abusive to her when he'd had a few drinks. Now, again, it's a completely different time. This is the 50s, where a man hitting his wife wasn't necessarily seen as something bad. Corporal punishment was in schools, and that wasn't seen as anything bad. But it did seem that seemed to be part of their lives. Perhaps. Maybe it was only once or twice or a few times. Maybe the night of the murder was the very first time. But it didn't seem like it. And there was something in the police report as well that said that Diane, at some stage recently, before the murder, had called the equivalent of child protective services, like the social services. Now, it might have been something completely innocent and completely unrelated to, her child or anything like that, but it was noted in the police report that she had done that. And then, secondary to the police report, I did speak to people that interviewed several people who told me that they thought that he was abusive occasionally. And I did have, just before publication, actually, I spoke to someone who was a friend of Diane's, who was very close to her when she moved up to Fairbanks, and said she saw her with bruises and stuff. And Diane would just say, "Oh, that's just Cecil. That's just Cecil," which, is the, unfortunately, the cry of many abused domestic relationships still today. It's dismissed as something that just happened once, or it's just something that doesn't look as bad as it is, or it's just the way someone is. And you have to remember, again, this is 1953. There weren't that many options for a woman if she decided to maybe initiate divorce proceedings against a man. Cecil was extremely rich and influential. This wouldn't have been a time where she probably didn't even have a bank account. There's certainly no credit cards. What would she have done with herself? And plus, she would have probably wanted to take Mark with her, and that would have been a nightmare of all proportions. So, sometimes, like happens in so many relationships still today, it's the sort of price of admission. People are prepared occasionally for, maybe if someone has too many drinks, that they might get a little violent. And it seems possibly that that's what might have happened on the night of the murder. That there had possibly they'd been out, they'd been drinking late. Maybe that had happened, and that was one of the clues that made me think as to one of the alternate versions as what might have happened in relation to the murder, or the cause of the murder. There are several theories, and I discuss them all at the end of the book. I give them a chapter each and sort of look into them and try and examine them, and to see which is the most likely. But that one certainly started to come up, and there was a couple of conversations I had. There's a guy called Glyn Martin who worked for the LAPD for 30 years. He wrote a book with James Elroy, actually, called LAPD 53, funnily enough, 1953. And I talked to him and interviewed him a couple of times about this, and he gave me some very convincing arguments and statements about what he thought had happened. And you'll see some of the pictures in the book. There's nothing. As I've said, it's a very sad story all the way along.
Yeah, speaking of photos from your book, one in particular is very telling. Diane is sitting on the lap of a man with a big grin on his face, black curly hair, and it wasn't Cecil.
Yeah.
Can you tell us who this guy was?
Yeah, that's sort of the bit that we haven't talked about yet, is the third suspect, as I call him. Actually, as he was described in the press. In fact, he was described as the third suspect by law enforcement, and named, actually, in the press, all but named. But his location and his manner of business was talked about in the press. Yes, that was what we'd call the third suspect. And when I saw that picture that you described, where it's Diane basically clearly sitting on someone's lap. You can't get that close together, sitting on someone's lap, and she looks like she's having fun, and he looks like he's having fun. When I saw that picture initially, I thought that was her and Cecil, because I was like, who would usually sit together that closely, in a photograph? Yeah. But it wasn't. It was Diane, and it was a guy called William Columbany, and he had a really, really interesting story. Long story short, he lived in the Northwood building as well. he had come up from Anchorage around about the same time as Cecil and Diane had done, and he was a ballroom dancing teacher. He gave ballroom dancing lessons, and Cecil and Diane took lessons from him. It was in the Northwood Building. There's the Northwood Building. I mean, we don't really have hotels that are like that today, but it was what we would call like a service building. So the building would have, it would have a laundry downstairs. Might be a barber, or there was still a barber there last time I was in. There would be, there'd be a bar. There would be a cobbler. There would be all sorts of within the bottom shelf of the building. The street level, so that you really just never had to leave the building, which in Alaska is always useful because it can be cold for months on end. But the Northwood was like that, like the old hotels used to be, where everything was right on hand. You didn't have to leave the building. And so he ran a ballroom dancing school. I mean, that wasn't unusual. There was a woman who ran a hula dancing school, Hawaiian dancing. She lived in the Northwood and gave lessons. So they met doing dancing lessons. Cecil and Diane went for lessons, and they were neighbors. They both lived in the Northwood Building, and they all became friends. They became friends socially and personally. But I think Diane and Bill as she called him, or Columbany, as I call him through the book, but they did become friends. And the unusual thing about that was that when Diane went down to Los Angeles, when she got bail after being arrested and charged, he went down to LA too, pretty much soon after. And they didn't live together. They weren't living together. He lived with his mother, who lived down here, and she was living with friends of theirs because she was with Mark as well. But he was very much a part of her life. He took Mark to school, and he seemed to be very much a part of her life. And of course, that raised a lot of questions in relation to several things. Were they the ones who were actually having an affair, or did they later have an affair? Was he somehow involved in what happened? He was within the building. He had been questioned at the time. He said he had been in and out of the building all night, the Northwood Building, because there was a bar there and he lived there. But they were clearly very close. And so I had to try and do some research to find out about his story. And that was really difficult. Because he was originally born in Guatemala and came to the US in the early 40s. And so it was nigh on impossible to find anything about his family in Guatemala going back, because the family name and the way it was done, it wasn't as easy as it was here. I did, however, find his granddaughter just by looking up on Google people with the same last name. Sometimes you just have to do that. It's a bit of a scattershot approach. And I did speak to his granddaughter, and believe it or not, she of course said, well, yeah, my mother is still alive, his daughter. And of course I wanted to speak to the daughter. She was quite elderly and not at all well. But she said to me, but she'll never talk about it. She's never talked to me about it. She will never she's certainly not going to talk to you about it. Now, I did try several times, and the daughter was really, really nice to me. She was very kind. She told me a lot of the family history. But she told me that William Columbany, when he was a younger man in Guatemala, had been married, obviously, and had 2 daughters. But he had run off with another woman, and this other woman had killed William Columbany's wife before they'd run off together. Now, of course, that blew the whole thing way open, because even though she said it wasn't William Columbany who actually killed his wife, it was William Columbany's girlfriend, that shows a propensity for killing love rivals, if you see what I mean. Now,
Yes.
Unfortunately, I couldn't get anything more than that. I couldn't get a name or a date. It never came to trial. There were never any arrests. And, talking to which would be, William Columbany's granddaughter was who I was talking to. She said, that she'd been strangled, or that she'd been stabbed, or that she'd been, and so I don't know. Ultimately, I think it was possibly that maybe she meant, her grandmother, it would have been, died perhaps more of a broken heart than was actually murdered. When she said, he killed her, he killed our family, I think it meant ruined the family, perhaps more, as opposed to actually killing her. But it was something I could never really talk about, because when she asked her mother about it, absolutely would not talk about it at all. Because, of course, her mother in one of them, and in one of the amazing coincidences in the book, her mother, of course, had not seen William Columbany, her father, since she was a small girl. Because her mother had been murdered, and then her father ran off with another woman. So she'd not seen her parents since she was a young age, which of course was exactly the same as Diane's two children from her first marriage. They hadn't seen their mother from a very young age either. So it was quite strange, the parallels between it. So anyway, long story short, Columbany and Diane were definitely close. Definitely close. I mean, he was very much looking after her. He was very much helping her. He helped all the way through after the murder, especially. He helped get some money for her and sell some of her goods and stuff because she had no money. She had nowhere to stay. She was couch surfing essentially. And this is Diane and her son who were couch surfing because they had a son together. And he moved down to LA, and I guess they were best friends, is what I would say. Now, as far as I could find from the evidence, without any too many spoilers, I'm not convinced that they were lovers. I'm not convinced about that. There are several strong indicators of that, but I'm not convinced myself. I did find out what happened to William Columbany. He was, in fact, the only person to go to jail in relation to the Cecil Wells murder. And that was 2 years later when he was brought up on a perjury charge in relation to the crime, which really was, as you might imagine, just a way for them to have a court trial that was kind of about the murder but wasn't. I dedicate a chapter or so in the book to this. So William Columbany is brought up for perjury in relation to some evidence he gave in relation to the trial to be. And he serves 60 days for that in Fairbanks. And then he leaves Fairbanks, and no one ever knew anything about whatever happened to him again. Now, I managed to find out he, in another one of those strange coincidences, he pretty much went straight to Vegas, which is like Alaska, and it's one of those places that people often go to reinvent themselves, to start again. He went to Vegas and he worked at one of the casinos, or at least that's what I was told. Worked at one of the casinos. I think it was as a dealer or something like that. He had a friend, and like I say, it's getting labyrinthine, but he did have friends who were important in Vegas. Guy McAfee, who was kind of one of the pioneers of Las Vegas, one of the early people. He set up one of the first clubs, one of the first casinos. Guy McAfee, his name was. Very famous. He was obviously a friend of William Columbany somehow, because during the trial that William Columbany was charged with perjury, Guy McAfee's wife sat at William Columbany's defense table with his lawyer. Now, she was not a lawyer. And at the time, the newspaper said, he has a friend with him. And then a couple of days later, they revealed that it was the wife of Guy McAfee, who was this big Vegas mobster, really. So I think that's probably how he ended up in Vegas, and he lived there all his life. He died there in 2011, and I managed to get his will and his probate and so forth. And he did have a sister who I was never able to track down, but he was the third suspect, and I think he was involved in what happened in relation to the murder, but I don't think he was someone who necessarily pulled the trigger, if that makes any difference. But they were certainly very close, and there were 2 or 3 things that made it very clear to me that they weren't lovers, but they certainly spent a lot of time together. But as I try and say in the book, maybe he was like the only person who was nice to her. Maybe the only person who was friendly, like, he was he helped look after Mark. He was kind to her. He seemed to look after her. Maybe he was in love with her. Maybe it wasn't reciprocated. Who knows? But yes, he was the third suspect. But again, there was never anything that could connect him to the crime. His fingerprints were tested, as I mentioned before. They came back as not a match. He had been seen a lot the night of the murder in the early hours. Lots of people had seen him. So if he had gone in somewhere and committed a murder and come back, he'd done it really quickly. And I don't think he committed the murder. But he and Diane had a very, very close relationship.
He was with her all the way up until her death.
Yes, no, that's a bit. That's a good lead into it. It's a bit of a spoiler alert. I mean, some of you might have guessed where this was going because, as I said, it's not a happy story. But what happened in the end was, like I said, Diane and her son Mark came down to Los Angeles and lived with friends for about 4 or 5 months here in Los Angeles, and then William Columbia followed down a couple of months later, very soon, and he was here the whole time. And as the trial approached, which was April 1954, Columbany and the friends she was staying with started to get more and more concerned about her, what we would call now mental health. She had been on antidepressants. As I found out from her eldest daughter, she'd suffered postnatal depression for both her children. And she was on antidepressants, understandably at the time, because she was extremely stressed, extremely worried about what was going to happen. She was very much terrified of what was going to happen to her son, her and Cecil's son, Mark, because obviously he was only 3, and so if she went to prison, what would happen to her son? She'd already lost 2 daughters that she was estranged from. Anyway, what happened was she probably maybe because she thought she'd outstayed her welcome staying at a friend's house, she moved into a hotel in Hollywood on Hollywood Boulevard, the Drake Hotel, and she stayed there for a while. She moved in about mid-February, about Valentine's Day. But a few weeks after that, after she'd moved in, she went out with William Columbany, went out for the evening to the movies. I looked up in the LA Times to see what movies had been playing, what they might have gone to see locally. And they went out to see the movies, and he was, trying to make sure that she was fine. He'd found that she was kind of hoarding barbiturates, which is what they prescribed for depression then. He'd found already once that she was hoarding them and had kind of taken them off her. But they went out to the movies that night, and she went back to the hotel and she checked out. She left 3 notes at the first hotel, went round the corner on Hollywood and Vine to a hotel called the Hollywood Plaza Hotel, which is very, very famous back in the day. It's still there. It's not a hotel anymore, but it's very famous. She checked into a room there and she took a large overdose of barbiturates. And she wrote it was maybe 1 or 2 of the final suicide notes, and died in the early hours of the next day. And it's actually there's some of the pictures, some of the newspapers, the newspapers in LA were quite salacious in those days and would not back away from printing suicide notes and printing, the body coming out covered in a white sheet, that kind of thing. That was very common. So they printed the suicide notes, and the picture actually of Diane being pulled out with the white sheet over her. There's a man standing with his back to the camera. That's William Columbany, because he and their friend had gone round the next day when they found out she checked out, gone to this hotel, and found that they were too late. So she had taken a barbiturate overdose, and she left 4 notes, and 2 of them were to Columbany. And as I said, they were notes that, whilst affectionate and thankful, were definitely not the notes to someone who was a lover of some kind. There was also a third note was to a couple that Cecil and Diane knew very well, had known for a long time, where Diane bequeathed Mark to them and asked them to raise Mark as their own son. And then there was a final note, which was written pretty much as she was losing consciousness. I mean, it's almost illegible, but it's kind of it's sort of like a rambling semi-confession, but not really. It kind of says, if I'm responsible for Cecil's death, and I guess I'm guilty in some way. So it doesn't really say that she did it, and she never mentions Johnny. She never mentions that they had an affair, and if there was any time where she was going to say who committed the crime or put the blame on someone else, I think that would have been the moment, and she didn't do it. So there were the 4 notes, and then there was a final scrap of paper, which was the most tragic of all. I've got it in front of me here on my desk. It's a scrap of paper, the corner of a piece of paper, or from a telephone directory or something, and it says Happy Valentine's, and there's a little picture of a heart underneath in it, and it says I love you underneath it. Now, I guess she'd written that roughly around Valentine's Day. Maybe it was meant for Mark. Maybe she was going to give it to him. Maybe it was for Johnny. Maybe it was for somebody else. Maybe she had met somebody else in the 4 months that she'd been in LA. But that was the huge scandal of it. When she died, that made all the newspapers again, and you would have thought that was the end of the story. Certainly, the law enforcement were pretty certain that that was going to be the end of the story and that this was never going to come to trial. However, DA Ted Stevens up in Fairbanks, this was early in his career. He had to make this one count. The chief of police had long ago resigned, kind of battered out of the force by several things, but mainly this case. So the DA was still determined to prosecute, which meant he was now focused on Johnny Warren.
Some of the interviews you conducted with her family members, there was some belief that she didn't die by suicide. It could have been murder instead.
Yeah. Yeah, it totally, I completely understood. Her eldest daughter, who's called Sandra, from her first marriage, she had two daughters, Sandra and Bonnie. Sandra's the one I've got to know really well, and she's been really, really supportive and so open all the way through. She was the one who was 5 when Diane left, and she never saw her again, whereas her sister Bonnie was like a baby, like less than 2, and doesn't really remember much about her mother at all. But when I spoke to Sandra and I went to see her in Texas, obviously she's married over the years and has her own children and so forth, and her daughter was there, and it was tough to kind of to listen to her talk, and she was convinced that it wasn't suicide. She felt that she'd been murdered, and she was also fairly sure that and it's her mother after all. It's not Diane, it's her mother. Hadn't committed the murder either, but the coroner's report, it's very clear. I mean, it's a huge dose of barbiturates, and sure, someone could have held a gun to her head and made her write all those suicide notes, I guess, and made her eat, swallow all the pills. But if someone was going to do that, if I was going to do that, I'd have made her name someone in the suicide notes, and take the blame well away from me. I would have made those suicide notes, specifically say, I did it, or, this is the person who did it. And then people would have taken it as what had really happened. But there was nothing like that in the suicide notes. And, she had been on antidepressants, and she had not been happy, and she'd been terrified about the trial. And she felt that justifiably, she felt she'd been railroaded into it, and whatever was happened, she was going to go to prison. And that was not a great option at the time, as of course it isn't now. But most of all, as she said in one of the suicide notes to the couple that she wanted to look after Mark after she had gone, she just wanted to spare him a trial. She just wanted to spare him the humiliation and embarrassment of a trial. Now, of course, he was only 4, and by all accounts, he'd found, hanging around policemen and going to courts quite fun, because he didn't have any idea of the conception of what was going on. But she did not want him to go through that. And of course, there are several reasons why no one would want to go through that, because clearly there was going to be some sort of custody issues afterwards. It was unlikely she'd ever get to see him again, or not much anyway. She also knew probably that if she went to prison for killing Cecil, why would he ever want to see her again? My mother killed my father. And, there was also the issue of, if it came to trial, one of the things that they found in the autopsy was that Diane had actually recently been pregnant. That was the big reveal post-suicide. She'd recently been pregnant. Now, whether she'd had a miscarriage or whether she had had what was called in those days an illegal operation, because abortions were completely illegal, very easy to get, but expensive and often dangerous. But she'd either had a miscarriage or a termination. And I am sure she well knew that if she walked into court, 6 months pregnant, because I worked it out from the last time maybe she might have had sex with her husband, maybe the last time she might have had sex with Johnny, maybe the last time she maybe have slept with someone else. She might have walking into the court pregnant and saying, "This is my husband's child. Please don't send me to prison. I want to be with him," would have been something that would have been genuine and maybe would have helped with the case as it might have gone. If she'd walked into the court as well, some people also might have thought, that's Johnny Warren's baby. And of course it would have been a black baby, which was a huge scandal in those days. And, it could also have been someone else's child. Maybe it was Columbany's child. Maybe they did sleep together once and she was pregnant, But whatever happened, she was pregnant. She decided to get rid of the child, and she made that choice. And that can have a lot of psychological effects on a person.
Yeah.
And, if that had come out in the trial, because I guess she would have still been pregnant, or maybe they would have found out, maybe it would have affected, the inheritance that Mark would have got, all these issues that we would never think of. But, Cecil was very wealthy, and he was supposed to be a millionaire. They always talked about him being a millionaire businessman. He had a lot of money and a lot of property, and it all got very nasty over the will, as you might imagine. And it turned out in the end that theoretically Mark wasn't even a legitimate child. Diane and Cecil were married, but Diane was technically still married to her previous husband at the time. Now, technically, if that got out, the family could say, listen, we're not going to give that child any of his money. He's illegitimate. They might have cut her off and cut him off. I mean, I never heard anyone say anything like that to me. That only sort of became a public knowledge in articles after this. And I don't think anyone really knew it at the time, because I've gone through the probate, 700 pages of it up until 1970. And it was never mentioned in there. I mean, maybe the family they wouldn't have cared. Maybe they'd have just thought, you know what, he's our son, he's our grandson, we will look after him, because he had money put aside in a trust. He had money that was for him every month, so he wasn't going to suffer, apart from the fact, that he didn't have parents. And so there was a custody battle very soon after Diane's suicide, and there were 3 or 4 people within who applied for custody. There was the couple that Diane had left the suicide note for. They said that they would happily take Mark if that was what the court agreed, and they did. He stayed with them for a few months while a lot of things were being sorted out. There was the couple that had put them up when Diane and Mark first came to Los Angeles. They said if they were asked, they would do it. There was Diane's mother, who lived in San Francisco. She said, of course, that she would willingly want to take Mark. There was one of Cecil's children, one of his eldest sons, and there was Cecil's sister. Also said that she would take Mark as an adopted child. And in the end, that was what happened. Mark went with Cecil's sister, and I'm sure probably people who are listening, or certainly one of the major questions I had when I was doing the book was, whatever happened to Mark? Whatever happened to that young boy? I mean, the press coverage was pretty unpleasant. They called him the murder orphan and the poor little rich boy and stuff like that. And all his pictures, he's laughing. He's just a little kid with blonde hair, and there are some pictures of him and Diane, and they clearly got on well. It seems like it anyway. And so he was barely 4 years old and had all this money in trust. And I did speak to him. I did track him down. And I spoke to him once. I didn't expect him to get in touch with me. And the one time I spoke to him, I was so surprised he called me back. He was really excited that I was doing something. He himself had felt that there was a big story to be told. He was very, very keen to be involved. And I thought, well, this book's going to write itself. I'll just have to talk to the son, because, he was very young at the time, but he was the closest to what was happening. I mean, thank goodness he wasn't in the house the night of the murder. He was actually staying with his grandmother, but he was the closest and would have known the most. But then he wrote a letter to me a couple of weeks later. It was very polite and wishing me luck, but saying he didn't want to have anything to do with it, which I understood, which was a pity. I mean, but then, I just thought, what am I going to tell him? It doesn't bring them back. And, that was pretty much the attitude I had throughout. Is I found out lots of things that I knew many of these family members didn't know. And I just thought, should I be telling them this? Should I tell them this, or should I just let them read it and make their own decision?
Right.
Because I just thought I can't change anything, and I can't bring them back. And I'm not a counselor. I'm not professionally qualified to deal with this. It's not my business. So ironically, the distance that I had helped in that area, because I just thought it's not my job to reunite families. It's not my job to make these people talk to each other. Why should they want to talk to each other after all this time? Some people might want to know more, and I've had several replies from. I sent all the family members who I interviewed copies of the book, and which was terrifying. I was absolutely terrified because
Yeah.
I just thought they would read them and go, "How dare you write all this? This is all completely wrong. You're so wrong. This is completely. Where did you get this? This is all a lie." And so far, I guess maybe they'd never get in touch with me if they did think that. But so far, the 3 or 4 that I've had back, they've been usually very polite and just said that you've told me so much I didn't know. It was really interesting. I really appreciate it. Thanks for doing it. All the way through,
Yeah.
there were only 1 or 2 people who really didn't want to talk to me or didn't want to talk about it, and mainly because it happened when they were children. They said, honestly, I really don't have anything to tell you, and our family certainly never talked about it. So it was a tragic tale. It's a tragic tale, like every domestic murder is. It's a tragic tale, and there's really only a couple of good stories that came out of it. People that I interviewed who seem relatively happy in their lives and with what happened, because how can that not affect your life? And so I kind of rushed to publication in the end because I got 2 or 3 calls from some of the people I'd interviewed, and they said, look, X, Y, and Z. He's not well at the moment. He's been asking about the book. I know he'd really love to read it. So I thought, right, it's time to put it out. I was going to wait till October because that's the anniversary of the murder. It's a hook, but several people said, we'd really like to read it sooner than later. So I was like, okay, that's totally fair because they're the ones who I really wanted to read it.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. That makes sense. You followed Johnny Warren's story to the end, right? As best you could.
Yes, I did. Like I said, they never let that go. I mean, they never let the case go, but post Diane's death, I assumed when I read about that must have been it. They certainly called it to a halt, but they didn't. The case was always open. Over the next 5 or 6 years, subsequent police and U.S. Marshals and so forth in Fairbanks who came into the position did occasionally send weapons to be checked to match the bullet. They sent fingerprints occasionally to be checked, and there were periodical assessments that the trial is coming, the trial is coming. Sometimes they even set dates, but then they would cancel it again or delay it again. And it was always top of the list. I mean, it was a grand jury thing, but again, because Alaska was a territory, they used to have a grand jury that would sit once a year, and they would have to go through 200 cases. And, if they didn't have time to get to the big ones or that there was a problem with it, they would just move on to the next one. And so it sat for years and years and years. Now, I don't know how Johnny ever felt about that. I mean, maybe he always felt that he was looking over his shoulder. But what I did manage to find out, from the archives and so forth, that he had actually been married 5 times in his life as well. But by the end, he'd married sort of several times when quite young, which was, again, very common going back a century. I mean, we don't think of it in that way, but 100 years, well, not 100 years ago, it's not that far back, but a lot of the time ago, you didn't often live with your partner before you married them, for example. So usually marriage was like the way a relationship began, really. So a lot of marriages didn't, I mean, it seemed like everyone in the story had been married 3 or 4 times. But I did track down he did have a son, just one son, with his last wife, who was actually, again, strangely enough, considerably younger than him, about 20 years, something younger than him. So he became a father at 63. And that was his only son. Well, actually, it wasn't his only son. He did, with one of his previous lives, they had a child who was stillborn. I found that out. So he had a son who I met when I was in Texas. Again, I couldn't believe that Diane's eldest daughter, who was, in her late 70s, early 80s, lived 15 miles away from, Johnny Warren's son, who was, younger than me. He was like mid 30s. So I met
Right.
him, and it was really, really interesting because I didn't know what he looked like. Because I'd only ever seen pictures of Johnny when he was in his 30s, when he was in the newspaper. I didn't know what he looked like as an older man. And I was like, well, he's roughly the same kind of age as I guess John is now, because he was called John as well. The son was called John. I thought, I wonder what he looks like. and I had no idea of the racial background of his fifth wife. So I didn't know exactly what he would look like. But he walked towards me, and as soon as he smiled, he had the same like smile and the dimple. It was bloody uncanny. It straight
Wow.
away I knew that's the guy. And we sat down and talked for a couple of hours. He was really nice. He was really, really nice. He got about 13 or 14 years with his dad before he died of cancer. And they were pretty close. They shared a love of sports. They shared a bit of a love of music, obviously, because Johnny was a musician all his life. But I asked him whether he ever talked about it, whether ever talked about being in Alaska or living in Alaska or anything. Really, no. He had absolutely no idea about Diane Wells and the Cecil Wells murder. He said they only found out about it when, after he died, he and his mother were going through Johnny's possessions because they divorced by then, but they were still close. And he found a copy of Life magazine from 1953, which had the story in it, which covered the story. And so Johnny had kept the
Wow.
magazine, but they'd never seen it. Neither of them had. And, John said to me, I went to my mother and I said, "What is this?" And she didn't know what it was either. He'd never spoken to her about it. I mean, why would you? Why would you have talked about that? Yeah, so he had no idea. But it had been a short time, but a pleasant time with his father, and which gave me some hope. But that was a generation down, as it were. And so that was what happened to Johnny. So he was married several times after this particular period, and he ended up in Texas in the end. And he worked for I think it was a construction or something at a docks for years and years and years before he retired, and never played music live or anything again, particularly as far as he knew. Although I did find a record that I swear is by Johnny Warren, because he was a musician. And I thought, I wonder, did he ever make any commercial recordings? Because,
Huh.
back in the day, you could go into one of those vending machines and make a commercial recording. Um, and so I looked up Johnny Warren, which is not a great spelling for a unique name, but I managed to find on eBay there was a 7-inch single by a guy called Johnny Warren that seemed to be from around the right period. So I bought it off eBay, which I thought was such a waste of money. And I didn't open it for ages either because, they have a picture of it on eBay. And I was just like, well, it just says Johnny Warren. It's not like I know what his voice sounds like. Anyway, long story short, and I do mention it briefly in the book, there was a much longer section on it, but it really wasn't that important. When I finally opened the vinyl record, which was after I had seen John and told him that, I did have this record. And he's like, well, get it out, play it, record it and send it to me. It might sound like my dad. So I got the record out and, I opened the record and I turned it over because obviously it's two sides on vinyl. And there was a signature on the record and a date. And I swear to you, it matches Johnny Warren's signature.
Wow.
Now, it could be a complete coincidence that a man called Johnny Warren bought a record by a man called Johnny Warren. I mean, maybe he bought it because, it was the same name as he was. But I looked up the signature and it looked just the same as Johnny Warren's signature on his birth certificates and not birth certificates, marriage certificates and stuff. And I was just like, God, this could have been him. This could have been him. It was like 63, something like that. 1963 was and it could have been him. And you know what I'm saying? It was him. I tried to track down the production company, the producer, all of nothing. He covered a very famous song. What's that Willie Nelson song? Not "I Will Always Love You," but one of the really famous Willie Nelson ones was a cover. But anyway, like I said, that was one of my diversions down a place that I shouldn't have gone. But I think that was a record that he might have recorded and kept. And I managed to find a copy of it, which was absolutely crazy to me. And, like I say, that wasn't an enormously important part of the story. But the reason that I really thought it was because A, the signatures matched, and B, because Johnny Warren, he was actually, his legal spelling of his name was Johnny, Johnie. that was the legal spelling of his name. So when he signed official documents, he signed it that spelling because you have to use, your legal name. But in everything else you ever see anywhere else ever, he's Johnny in the way that we would expect it to be spelt, Johnnny. But on this record, he'd put like his legal name, Johnny Warren. And I thought, that does it for me.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that he might have done this one record. And, I recorded it and I played it, and I played it to John and he played it to his mother, and they were like, well, we didn't know what his voice sounded like in 1963. It's hard to say definitively that it's him, but still, to my mind, so he got to put a record out at least. And he was a really competent musician, multi-instrumentalist, singer. He had pretty much his entire career was working up and down like the West Coast as a musician. So that was what happened to him. So he died in, I think it was 1999.
Wow. Well, gosh, thank you for spending so much time with us here.
Well, I know it's really hard to not get it to be overwhelmingly with so many facts and figures. But within the book, I do try and tell it like a story, and I make it chronological. And then I sort of mention the 4 main theories at the end. And then the last chapter of the book is what I think happened on the night of the murder based on the evidence. And it is, I don't really make anything up. The only thing I make up is, what I think happened, who pulled the trigger. Hopefully by the time you get to that stage, you kind of read it and you think, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense as to what happened. But, and I think today, if this happened today in exactly the same way, I think we would look at what happened and look at Diane and how we would treat her in a very different way. I think everyone would still immediately condemn her as, the beautiful young blonde who's after the rich husband's money. I think that would still happen. I think everyone would still be shocked that she'd had an affair with, a black musician. I think that would still be shocking. But I think if it came to trial, she might have got a much fairer shake than she would have got at the time. But we'll never know. I put in like an afterword, an epilogue. People want to go back to 1963 and, stop the Kennedy assassination or something like that. But me, I'm like, I want to go back to the night in that room and see what happened. Because you can't change the past, and I can't bring these people back. But at least within the book, I can give those who do care about it and who wanted to know more information than they knew already, for whatever good that makes. But I wanted to find out what happened. And I guess I did in a way, but whether it's an entertaining read or anything, I don't know. But it was as honest as I could get it.
Oh yeah, it's well researched and quite entertaining too. So for people who want to get your book,
okay. So obviously it's available on Amazon, and you can obviously the website is the AlaskanBlonde.com. That's blonde with an E because it's a woman. So it's the AlaskanBlonde.com, and then obviously the Facebook page is the Alaskan Blonde, the Instagram page is the Alaskan Blonde, and the Twitter, they're all pretty much the same, but the Twitter one is Alaskan Blonde 53 because I couldn't get the Alaskan Blonde, but I put Alaskan Blonde 53 because that was the year. But that's where I sort of put stuff on there and post things. The site has a few things. I might start putting up a lot more pictures and things as time goes on because I've got a lot. But yeah, the book is out there now, and Amazon, I guess, is the best place to do it. It is available in some bookstores here in LA, and it's obviously in Alaska. It's in a fair few bookstores and the Barnes and Noble and stuff there, because that's obviously where they still have an awareness of the story. It's mainly the older timers now who remember it. But most of the time when I talk to places in Alaska about it, after a second, people are like, oh, yeah, I remember that. Whatever happened with that? And that's when I say, well, it's in the book.
Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Way too long there. Way too long. I'm sure people will all turn off long before the end of this.
I doubt it. Thanks again.
Well, thanks for having me. I really hope anyone who reads it does enjoy it because it's a fascinating story. there's nothing stranger than people. But there were other things in the story and connected to it that were just, I'd read it and I'd be like, this can't be true. And it was true.
Again, I have been speaking to James T. Bartlett. He is author of The Alaskan Blonde, Sex, Secrets, and the Hollywood Story That Shocked America. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.